Yes, I have my own YouTube channel, which I do vlogs on, but I also have a channel called Horatio Podium where we do some podcasts with some people from around the globe who have a lot of experience in debating or at least have a diverse background in debating. So even say from novices to other people, all of them have had the chance to sort of like speak on it. I'll do that after the workshop. Or maybe I have a minute right now, so I might just do it right now. Give me a second. I'll try to get it to you. They're both fairly new ventures, so you won't find like a lot of material on them. This is one of them, and then this is my own one. Great. Perfect. Let's just start then. With that out of the way. Great. Thank you. Welcome to this workshop. I would not profess that I am a completely educated individual when it comes to IR, but I hope that this workshop is fun. Teaching IR is usually very boring, so I just hope that I make it a bit less so and less burdensome to you. All right. Is my screen clearly visible to all of you? I would just need a confirmation from you all. Could somebody confirm, please? Okay, great. Right. Why have we named this workshop the way that we have? Let's just begin with that. So, I think one of the fundamental things that international relations is not understood to be in debate spaces is that it is not just like a part and parcel standalone thing, but rather it's also part of a lot of other global narratives which have run across for a very long time, right? So I'll just give you a brief overview of what we are covering in this session, and then we'll sort of like proceed part by part through it. And I'll also give you a very brief background about who I am, what I do, and why am I giving you a workshop on international relations. So, firstly, I think we'll go through a couple of ideas about what this topic entails and what essentially is the workshop going to cover and how we're going to go about it. The second part would sort of deal with what are essentially these global discourses, what essentially are the actors which are shaping these discourses on a global forum, and then how global discourses have had impacts on public policy and decision making, and also have changed public opinion in different countries. So we'll try to do some activities around that and see how different countries have different discourses when it comes to sort of discussing international relations and also their relations with neighboring states and other aspects. The next part would deal with certain key themes or key topics in international relations, which include realism, liberalism, constructivism, what essentially are the differences between hard and soft power, state sovereignty, global governance, interdependence, globalization, and so on. The last four sections are essentially, in the gist of it, going to identify what relevant theories apply to what portions of debate, how that you understand what are the actor motivations for any specific debate, and then work around those actor motivations to sort of give yourself a better position in that debate space. And we'll also look at certain key narratives which are currently there as part of global discourses in international relations. Right. Moving on. So, who am I? I am a law graduate. I am currently based out of India. The reason why I believe that international relations is so close to my heart is because of the idea that I have learned a lot about international law during my 5 years in law school. But it also helps me also teach people about international relations simply around the idea that I have had certain experiences which have molded me towards it. By no sense is this workshop going to cover each and every aspect of international relations for you. However, you will be getting like a clear picture about where to start your own readings, how to go about discussing different aspects of international relations in workshops, after this which are more specific, but in also debate sessions which really deal with like these particular types of debate motions related to these topics, but also around, say, having general ideas and discourses around this particular theme. Um, we've already covered like what we'll be discussing. So let's just move on to a small icebreaker activity. So I'll just want everybody to like, if possible, unmute and tell me about where they're from, because that will also be a key factor in our activities going ahead, and then we'll be discussing certain things around that. So I don't see any names on my screen. So if you would kindly unmute yourself, even like a couple of volunteers, to just give me sort of like an idea about where you're from, what essentially is your background, and how we can then sort of like build that into the workshop in the further activities will be something which is very interesting. Would anybody like to volunteer? I can only see Pratham, Aditya, Gopal, and Shahid's name on my screen in the tiny window that I have. So, Pratham, would you like to go ahead and sort of give us an introduction as to where you're from and your background a bit, if you don't mind?
Hi guys, I'm Pratham. Am I audible?
Yeah, 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 perfectly audible.
Yeah, I'm from Bangalore. I've been debating for the past 2 years. And yeah, I usually do judge tournaments and I kind of struggle at speaking, mostly because I don't find any teammates. So here's hoping I'll find some teammates in the future. But yeah, I usually judge and I'm from Bangalore. My team is called up. So yeah.
That's perfect. Aditya, would you like to give me a brief about where you're from?
Hello everybody, Aditya. I'm from Delhi, currently studying in Delhi University. Tried to get into NLUs now, tried to getting into CLC, law aspirant. Been debating for 2 years, have adjudicated more than I have debated, and yes, looking forward to learning IR because I suck at it.
Thank you so much. Gopal, Shahir, if anybody would like to go ahead.
Hi, Gopal. I'm from Delhi only. Just completed DU. I'm pursuing finance CFA. Want to like pursue MBA in finance as well. Been debating for 1.5 year or so. Yeah, I mean, if I were to say that just the last 6 to 8 months of my debating journey have been active, otherwise I was not. So yeah, that about it. Thanks a lot.
Great. Shahir and anybody else, if they would like to go ahead.
Yeah, hello, I'm Shahir. Hope I'm audible.
Yeah, yeah, perfectly so.
Yeah, I'm from Pakistan, Lahore, if you know the city. And I started debating this past August. I'm in like my last year of high school, and that's all.
Perfect. Anybody else would like to go? Like, I see Shubhan, Ojasvi, Kaushika, Tawang. There are some very unique names, Debater B and Spec as well. So let's also find some other people also to find. Asta, you unmuted yourself. Do you want to go ahead?
Yeah. Yeah, so hi, I'm Astha. I'm from Jaipur, currently in Ahmedabad studying in Emma University, and I'm really new to debating. Actually, me and Ojasvi, we are teammates. We have an upcoming tournament in DTU. The people from Delhi can just let us know ki how DTU works. So we're really new to debating. I've done only one comp, that is IIT Bombay, and that too I just worked up. So yeah.
Great. Would anybody else want to go ahead?
Hello everyone, Kaushika this side. I am from Rajasthan. At the moment, I'm currently pursuing bachelor's in commerce from Delhi University. I'm a fresher. I've done debating in school, but I am new to this and I am not good at IR. So I'm really looking forward to learning a lot.
Happy to have you all here. Last couple of responses if anybody else is interested before we go on. So all this is relevant because I'm asking your backgrounds because all of this would be very, very relevant in the next activity that we do in a while. So it's essentially going to be very important that we have a discussion around what backgrounds we have so that we understand how international politics work. A lot of us are from India. Some of you introduce yourself from being from Pakistan as well. And I think that has a lot of good ground point for us to have discussions as well in the activities. So anybody else, or we'll move ahead.
Hello.
Yes, Tawang, go on.
Hello. So my name is Tawang, and I'm from Indonesia. I'm currently around probably like 1.5 years into debating, and I'm still trying to get better at it. So yeah.
Perfect. Okay. I'm also from India. I have been properly debating for 5 years continuously, but I started off 8 years back and then took a like 2, 3 year hiatus. So it's been a while. It's nice to meet you all here. So hoping that you all can get something out of this workshop too. Just a couple of groundkeeping rules so that we just don't disrupt each other as well. I am happy to take questions at any point of time in the workshop. Please use the raise hand feature. I can notify, it notifies me and I can sort of like have a discussion on from the topic that you are having doubts on. Otherwise, during activities, we'll try to split you into small groups so that you have better amount of chance to participate. But regardless, there will be a lot of content which will help you, I'm pretty sure. But if there is something that you have more doubts about, you can reach out to me at the end as well without any problems. Okay, perfect. So first things first, let's just go into sort of understanding what essentially do we mean when we talk about global discourses in the relations that we have with different global partners, in the terms that we have in terms of international political dynamics. A lot of things have sort of intrinsic conversations associated with them. So, for example, a lot of people here in the meeting would know that Indonesia has very different geopolitical considerations compared to, say, what India has or what Pakistan has, right? So, all of these have sort of like issue, intuitive pushes that come around in terms of the way it looks in the world. So let's just sort of have this conversation quickly and understand what essentially do these global discourses look like. So whatever we understand as global issues, for example, the Ukraine conflict or say issues around say Iran or how Trump is right now doing economic warfare in terms of economic tariffs with different countries around the globe. I think all of those come under the broad umbrella of global discourses. So IR is co-joint with a lot of things like international economics and also say aspects like climate change and other aspects. So all of these have sort of an interplay in the world where we have trade-offs which we need to look at in terms of analyzing different narratives, but also in terms of analyzing how ideologically different countries operate and what kind of power dynamics are there in the world. So essentially, when you're debating in this particular sense, global discourses to you would look like international relations, economics in terms of the international um, institutions or international ways in which countries influence economic power, but also culture and environmental issues, to name a few, right? So these are done through discourses in terms of diplomatic channels or other aspects, but there are also other sort of like key concepts that come around in terms of talking about global discourses in relations to international relations. Firstly, we sort of will analyze what globalization as a discursive construct would be, but also we need to understand what transnationalism, cultural imperialism, and global governance looks like. So, first things first, let's just look at how discourses are shaped in the world, right? For example, let's look at the aspect of India. India has a very unique situation on the way in which it operates globally. So, for a very long time, India has had this idea of neutrality where it approaches different conflicts globally with the idea that it will not take a stance on either side of the spectrum. So this might be during the Cold War, there might be issues which have US on the center stage against Russia or Soviet Union at that period of time, and India does not really take any stances. So these all sort of look at how global governance impacts international institutions, but also international dialogue between different countries, but also how, say, countries themselves operate internal politics and external politics, which we look at differently through the eyes of, say, international relations. So when we are talking about globalization as a discursive concept, it is essentially that we have shaped different narratives and we have had different conversations in the global footprint, and that has changed the way in which global scenarios operate. For example, if we talk about, say, the breakdown of the Soviet Union, where it went into different states, those particular regions have very different dynamics from, say, West Germany and East Germany joining up after, say, the fall of the Berlin Wall. So all of these discourses have shaped the history of these countries and all these regions in a very different ways, in which we will have to immerse ourselves to understand what kind of benefits or harms come around in terms of analyzing different debate motions. So the idea simply here becomes that you have some sort of like an information point where you can analyze different aspects of these issues and have some amount of general basic ideas. How do you go about doing that is something that we'll discuss later on in the workshop. But essentially, it means that you will have to have some idea about history to understand what are the motivations of these states, because states have sovereignty and other things that they need to care about and internal things that they need to care about, which leads to having certain amount of global narratives which they will participate in. For example, India will not like to say align itself, as I mentioned, due to neutrality. But for instance, in terms of US has historically maybe aligned with Pakistan by providing them weapon systems and other aspects. So there are different ways in which history has operated in the world, which leads to different interests in these institutions as well. So just for clarity here, yes, Pratham, go on.
Does all of this history knowledge come under ordinary intelligent voter knowledge?
In a sense, you need to understand that there are fundamental standoff right here, that you sort of need to understand what has happened in the past on the idea that that has occurred. Maybe a very specific example from that conflict may be something which escapes the idea of, say, an average intelligible voter. But essentially, you do need to understand that, right, there was World War One, there was World War Two. A There was an Axis, there was Allies won, Axis lost. Axis had certain political motivations, the Allies had certain political motivations. Those simplistic terms you need to completely understand, so that you can have some sort of like stable bedrock to understand IR motions well, but also to apply yourself properly to IR motions. So the idea here simply becomes that just awareness might not be enough for you to get an idea about how to form arguments cohesively, but also give the arguments in a way in which it is structured, right? So there might be some need for you to go into, say, details. But of course, you're not a history buff. I'm not a history buff. We can't just go willy-nilly and go into the studies and then have every idea that we have, because we are not historians by trade, right? So I think, to begin with, I think the easiest way to approach this is to have an understanding of maybe what were the wars which happened in the past, what were the motivations for those wars to occur, what are the current global political issues, because I think most motions these days would focus on what is happening on the ground today. For example, I'll take an example of a debate which happened last week for me. They had an issue about, say, so they had a motion structured around the issue of Somaliland, and they had some conversations around different aspects, but also the issues around, say, the Myanmar conflict, where the junta is doing certain crimes, and also the junta is currently in power. So these are current narratives. The Ukraine war is a current narrative. The issues in Myanmar are current narratives. The issues in South China Seas are current narratives. So whatever is a current narrative, I'm pretty sure that you would be better off learning about those things in more detail. But otherwise, also, it's better to have some sort of historical idea about what are the political motivations, broad political motivations of major actors in the globe, which becomes the US, the UK, the European Union, European countries, China, India, because these are the places where you will be sort of getting motions around, and also the current conflicts around the world. Okay, Pratham, I hope that answers your question.
Yep, it does.
Perfect. So let's just quickly roll into, say, transnationalism, right? So I was explaining to you the idea about how interactions in the globe occur and how interactions become sort of important in terms of giving you an idea about how to analyze things. For example, when you're looking at specific issues in India, for example, the Doklam conflict, the issues of border incursions by China into Indian territory and how India deals with it, all of these things become sort of important to consider how interactions between states also occur. So when you're looking at conflicts or situations which are currently in the narrative, you also need to understand what kind of implications these have on their sovereign interests, what kind of implications these have on, say, their neighboring countries. All of these things become relevant because that is where primarily your arguments will lie. Okay. Right. So there are a couple of things which happens in terms of the spheres of global discourses. It has, say, an implication in policy, where you have policy making which is undermined by a lot of relevant factors. For example, US has political leanings towards being a liberalistic state, and also having, say, this fight against global terrorism, which has been its agenda for a long period of time, and it has troops fighting wars beyond its own borders. So there are certain influences that leads to in terms of their internal policy making, and also this internal policy making would be sort of like important to analyze when they're dealing with other states as well. So if they're dealing with India on the issue of, say, terrorism, and they want India's help to counter terrorism or maritime piracy in certain regions of the globe, they will have very different ideologies around how to deal with these. So these implications are important to understand how narratives would occur as well. So you have to also be careful in understanding those policy spheres. Yes, Anish.
In any debate regarding terrorism, I have seen this that you can necessarily bring in this entire aspect that terrorism in itself is extremely subjective. One person's terrorist is another person's liberator. How do you ground the debate in such ground the motion in such debates?
Right. We can't go very in depth into this conversation simply because there are different ways in which motions are read. So, for example, if you look at US and 9/11, right? US has different inclinations towards 9/11, and its classification on these inclinations are very different than, say, what India would have done. So, to be the best in terms of these kind of debates, I think the simplest way is to understand that if, for example, this is an actor motion, you look at the political interest of that actor. But if this is not an actor motion and it is sort of like global discourses, sort of see where stakeholders are most impacted. Like terrorism might be something which would be very easy to separate because, for example, somebody might argue that you might call an independence fighter or independence movement in a country a terrorist movement as well. But I think the delineation of these two are very simple. One is where you're not really gaining any political sphere of influence, or nor are you gaining any sort of like discourse to do the freedom to move towards the freedom of the country. But sometimes terrorism is simply the act of somewhat conducting the individuals towards killing people and doing certain harms in terms of ethnic discourses or other discourses. So I think those kind of implications can be looked at in terms of differentiating yourself from how terrorism is viewed in the world to how, say, war is viewed in the world and other issues are viewed in the world, right? So also policy influence peers are also different in terms of the way in which actors would be motivated in these motions. So I can't give you a complete answer in terms of how you would align yourself into understanding who is a terrorist or not, because of course it is a subjective notion. Whichever side frames it better in a debate would win, and you might need to prove what kind of stakeholder motivations would lie in terms of the way in which you are viewing that motion, and then sort of like weigh it out on a scale. Yes, Naman.
Yeah, so my question is, these global narratives that you talk about liberalism or capitalism, all of these global narratives were intrinsically there and countries with their national narratives opted into them, or it was the other way around that the country's national narratives based on global power dynamics created these global narratives in the first place?
Okay, I'll just give you a two-pronged answer to this, right? First, I think the simple aspect of understanding where concepts originate from, political concepts originate from, is the idea that they first occur in states themselves. So, for example, if you're talking about capitalism, liberalism, neoliberalism, all of these things are propounded as theories which have been sort of like present in states and therefore ideated to be sort of available as a concept globally, right? For example, when we discuss realism, liberalism, and constructivism, you will see that there are certain things where it originated from the state, certain things where certain states were doing it in a certain form, certain states were doing it in a certain form, and then it sort of become a global discourse and it sort of had things cherry picked from different places. Since these political theories are run by political scientists, they have their own sort of like ways in which they cherry pick different aspects to write in their political theory. So we can't completely delineate an answer by saying that, right, political theory would be inclined towards having, say, a genesis in the state itself or a genesis in between two or more states. I think the simplest answer here would be to understand how that political theory is originating from. I think that would be a very interesting read for you, but also a very deep dive, which you do not always need an inclination to go in. You do not have an inclination to go into when you're doing, say, motion analysis for IR in terms of how that political theory is applying to that motion, because you just simply need to know what that theory indicates in the world and how that indication would sort of apply to your motion sense. So if you go too much into history driven narrative, it would be more factual than sort of like implied towards how you're constructing your arguments. Yes, Naman.
Yeah, just a follow-up to this question. The reason I asked this question was in the instances there are particular emotions requiring, I don't know, like affirmative action or something like that. In that instance, certain countries which have taken affirmative actions or have narratives surrounding affirmative actions, those countries would like those narratives would matter a lot more than any other countries not having historical affirmative actions in that instance, right?
Sure. Yes. So see, this is what I'm saying. I have discussed this in the previous slide as well, right? Because when we are looking at political inclinations, when we're looking at, say, the idea of terrorism as well, US's sphere of influence on this area is very different from India's sphere of influence, but also US's idea around how to combat terrorism is very different from India's idea of how to combat terrorism. India is more focused around internalizing its conflict against terrorism and stopping terrorism within its boundaries. And maybe US is more like, I'm going to go into the global stage, take out extremists from other countries which have, say, a chance to harm my own domestic soil, right? So I think this idea of affirmative action or any sort of motion around that sphere where it has sort of differences in the way in which the country would like to move ahead with it, I think that is very fair to make in a debate, but also it's very debate specific. So if you're talking about affirmative action, it varies also in the type of motion that you're doing, but it also varies in terms of the context that the motion is set on. So this would look very different in Somaliland. Like US taking action in affirmative action in Somaliland is very different. What kind of like policy sphere of influence does US have in Somaliland? What kind of interests have it has changes as well, right? Because I think one, for example, if you're talking about the Hormuz Strait or these particular areas, there might be inclinations to protect international maritime trade. That is why the security concern comes up. That is why they need to combat, say, piracy and then talk about these issues. So those narratives will be very different in very different spaces, which is why I keep telling you or reminding you that whatever is the current relevant conflicts or current relevant issues, you should focus on them because those are the places where these things would come up and these motions would come up from, and that is where you get the idea historically what is relevant or not. Okay. Hope that answers. I'll come to your point again when we come and discuss certain concepts and theories. Right now it's a bit premature to discuss it, so I'll take up any follow-ups later on. Okay. Right. So also social change and social issues, which I think Naman's question also was dealing with, has different like inclinations as to how political discourses occur in this state as well. This might look like, say, how law systems or legal systems are in countries, and therefore different legal systems would operate differently and therefore give different nuances in terms of your interactions with different people around the globe. Right. Now, how do we look at different actors in this space, which were being discussed in the previous slides? There are a couple of different ways in which you look at these peers. One is how states and governments operate, two, in how international organizations operate, and three and four, non-governmental organizations, multinational corporations, and then sort of digital influences like current social media outcomes and media outlets, and discussing different aspects around that. Let's go piece by piece, right? So states and governments, we have sort of discussed. People have influence through policy outcomes by either diplomatic efforts or by engaging in global conflict, which we have seen in the past. And there are different forums in which these occur as well. Sometimes these forums involve only two parties, where only states and governments from these two territories are occupied. So those are one type of an actor or one level of an actor. The second level of actor that we look at here is international organizations. These can look at different aspects like economics, global politics, shaping like framework reports and all. These could include people like the UN in terms of having a global space for political discourse, the IMF and World Bank in terms of having changing relations in economic policy and aspects around how IMF and World Bank operate in the world. So simple example here is that IMF and World Bank is majorly funded by the global north. So in many debates, you would also find that the way in which the IMF and World Bank secures its funding and then applies this funding or gives loans to developing countries are very important, in which these policy mechanics work in these developing nations and how these developing nations can utilize institutions like the IMF and World Bank. Similarly, in UN, there are different like agencies and bodies like the UNSC, the UNDP, and all the other places, right? So these also have different aspects in how they're exercising international power and international dynamics. The UN might have very little sphere of influence, but it also has sort of like agency structures in which certain amount of accountability metrics are there. For example, the UNSC has 5 permanent members, which have a lot of veto power, and therefore that is very important to consider when certain states have more power influence or power dynamics in the global narrative. So all of these things sort of have equal amount of shaping in terms of international relations in motion types. So you have to do a bit of background research on these as well. The third one is non-governmental organizations. So here things like Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International and all sort of have the ability to influence narratives and discuss policies. Similarly, there are certain inclinations when you're talking about international relations between states, right? Because, for example, there is a state which is a developing nation and that it needs investment through, say, international actors. The ones who are actually investing might be multinational corporations and other individuals. So from these spaces, there is a chance for different amount of economic benefits and cultural discourses happening within these particular nations. And therefore, the business practices of these developing and developed nations or the media presence in these nations calling out multinational corporations vary from scale to scale. So simply, I'll give you an example here. One, when you're talking about, say, developed nations and developing nations, the multinational corporations coming from developed nations have an incentive to have the best amount of profit margin and to get the best amount of lax labor regulations and other things in developing nations to have sort of like industrial development or industrial influence within these countries and then get economic benefits out of the presence in these industries. These can become important concerns because A, there might be social issues to it, there might be labor law issues to it, there might be regulatory issues to it. So all of these things give you sort of like an idea about how to shape those discussions around these issues in frameworks of debate where multinational corporations would be an important consideration. In the modern world, I think this was not very predominant in a debate space like 5, 6 years back. But the way that digital media is shaping diplomatic efforts and how people are calling people out in social media, reporting is happening in social media, and how the PR agendas and social media agendas and news agendas frame global discourses is also an important issue in terms of analyzing international relations and international power dynamics. So there are lots of impacts in public policy which come around from, say, discussing international relations. One, in that people with, say, more power have the ability to say what the narrative should be in the world. So US has more power in the world than, for example, a country like Kiribati or Maldives, which are very small nations, right? So they have an idea that they want to promote, and it's easier for them to push this idea on different actors in the world. So the policy priorities and solutions coming from these policies in international forums and in other places would sort of look like what these countries would want to push as a narrative on these smaller nations, right? So this is also an important aspect which you can sort of have in terms of covering different aspects of international relation related motions. This ties into the other three. We have already discussed legitimization through, say, policy and institutions like the UN, UNDP, World Bank, and IMF, but also how power dynamics affect different actors, which affect policy outcomes. Now, public opinion, which is the new prong or social neogen media that I might call, is sort of very important in our discourse about IR these days because simply there is a lot more ability for things like issues in Palestine to be highlighted across the globe now because of the presence of social media. So the way in which discourses are occurring and the way in which people are analyzing different international relation issues on the ground for stakeholders, as well as how countries and institutions are occurring or maybe putting off certain issues, are also very much spearheaded by how social media is pushing the narrative to a certain point, right? So globalization and cultural homogenization is also something which is very predominantly present in international relation narratives. So what we simply mean by this is the more that countries are opening up and more discourses occurring across the globe, there is a chance for cultures to interchange and discussions happen around different cultural values, which influences the opinions that we have across borders. So the exercise that we did where we introduced ourselves in terms of, say, where we are from, me as an Indian has a very different perspective of my relationships of my country to Indonesia or to Pakistan. And people in Pakistan have a very different perspective of India and Indonesia, for that example. So there is a chance for these public opinions to sort of homogenize, where all of the people might actively call out issues like Ukraine being invaded by Russia is maybe a bad thing, or maybe say the Palestine issue where Palestinians are being killed is a very bad thing as well. So all of these discourses have a very important turn point where they can sort of become global courses of discussion and global narratives. And it's much more easier a step to take right now because of the way that media platforms sort of occur. Now, I know that I have been speaking monotonously and that bores everybody. So I'll just do a quick, like, small activity. I'll just stop sharing my screen as well. So this activity is called the World Traveler, right? So what we mean by world traveler is essentially that maybe I am from India. I have different political considerations, institutional considerations, and ways in which we operate. So what I want right now, I'll try to divide you all into sort of like small breakout rooms. We'll take 5 minutes. All of you can sort of go ahead and discuss what kind of ways in which your country interact with these global narratives, and then how do these global narratives shape your world. This can be economic, this can be, say, political, this might be cultural, right? So just give me like 2 minutes. I'll just shuffle you all into breakout rooms, and we can just have like a discussion after that. I'll just go and moderate a couple of rooms from time to time. You can have your own discussions. So essentially, what you would need to do is talk about how these things occur in your world and how they're different from the other country the other person belongs to, and what kind of changes do you feel would be necessary to have a better public discourse related to this. Right. Please join your rooms. Hello, Kaushika, Gopal. Please join your rooms as well. Hmm.
मेरे से बात नहीं करती है आजकल।
Great. Hi. What was the discussion in your room? A lot of you are joining back now. We'll just wait later on then. Okay. Participants from breakout room 2, what did you discuss? I think most of you are here now. Yeah, you were not audible. Okay, we are back. All of us are back, I think. Right. Participants from breakout room 2, 4, and 5. Let's have 2 go first. What did your discussion lead to? What ideas did you get from your discussion? Anybody from breakout room 2 who is here? Naman, I think you were in breakout room 2. I think you had with you Tawang and Pratham as well. And in breakout room 4, I think there was Aditya and then 2 more people. And I remember that in breakout room 3, there was Payal, Gopal, and 1 more person as well. Could you just give me a highlight as to what you discussed? And then we'll quickly wrap up with the remainder of the workshop before we sort of head off. I know it's getting a
Okay,
bit later for you all as well.
sure, no worries. In the breakout room two, the discussion primarily revolved around two things. One, the entire economic motivations for like three countries, which is India, Indonesia, and Pakistan, and the political motivations of these particular countries and their alignment. For India, the major discussion revolved around how, even though they are neutral, their like political or economic policies align with Russia's to an extent, where they have been doing that since the entire US alignment with Pakistan scenario happened. But two, on the entire idea that they're currently facing tariff threats from United States, and they are poised at a very they're poised at a decision making point where they either have to go ahead and succumb to United States tariff threats and reduce their taxes, but also they can go ahead and have some degrees of benefit if they are not doing that, and they are going forward with the de-dollarization and BRIC summit approach on the economic motivations as well. On Indonesia, we got from Tawang. I'm really sorry if I'm butchering your name, but follow that. Indonesia, we got the idea that they are trying to expand their domestic markets where the state is owning some degrees of enterprises. And secondarily, as well, the Indonesian populace are neutral, but currently they're having some influence towards China, and China is also getting some degrees of like benefits, economic benefits for Indonesia as a whole. And as for Pakistan, ideally, what we got from Pakistan in that instance was the idea that they have described themselves to an extent as a security state, where economic situations like are a lot like they are suffering from a sort of debt crisis to an extent, but like also Pakistan has some degrees of benefits on the economic scale. Like they're trying to align themselves to an extent with global narratives. They're trying to align themselves to like, ensure that there is some degrees of economic benefits on their side of the world as well, based on like these are tokenistic approaches as said by the speaker, but like sure, that is still bringing some degrees of benefit towards the populace of Pakistan. And secondarily, the political motivations ideally then looks like India's political motivations revolving around the right wing sort of ideologies of religion politics currently, which is happening to an extent, but two, also on the idea that it's an economic development approach on a domestic level, which is the idea that India first approach and the tariffs and like international actors are taxed a lot more highly in India simply because they're focused on a make in India approach to an extent to focus on the domestic markets. For India, for Indonesia, the political motivations looks like they are trying to enter like post-reformation era where they're trying to stabilize after a dictatorship established and like revoked in 1998, and they are still having some degrees of economic equality where their political motivations and narratives are having populist narratives to an extent where like political leaders are focusing on a lot of like focusing on stabilization and economic development to an extent. And as for Pakistan, we did not ideally get that from their speaker ideally, so somebody else can contribute. Thank you.
Oh, that's a perfect summary. What about the other rooms? Let's just quickly have you before we go back to room 2. Room 4, I am forgetting who was there with Aditya actually. But it was all of them were from India, if I'm not wrong. And I think that was the same case in room 5 as well.
Yeah, hi. So I had Srijana and sorry, Ojasvi with me. So we
Yeah.
all were from India. So we started our discussion something around the lines of economics and religion in India and how it affects stakeholders and how politicians who choose to be or claim to be at the top of all of this are how are they affected by these certain policies, right? But what our discussion then evolved into, then what is the dual nature of a politician as to the politician acts very differently when he's thinking about votes within his country, and a politician thinks very differently when he has to go out and represent the country as a leader of the country, or let's say anything. So even and then our discussion, then we we got examples like how Modi can function, like how Modi will not care about Muslims in general, but then he has good relations with the Middle East countries like Syria, countries like Saudi. Then how does he not take in Rohingya Muslims in that case as immigrants? Then we also moved and talked about a bit about Russia, that in a country like Russia where democracy is a facade, does Putin then still care about internal backlash, or does his only goal is global power and everything? And then we also had a bit more factual discussion regarding the fact that Putin got his competitor killed last year in jail or something. So there's a certain aspect of fear also working within these politicians when when they're within their country and when they're outside their country representing the country. So this duality also changes the interests of an actor till some extent.
Good. Anybody else wants to chip in from that room, or just we, Srijana?
No, I think Aditya, summarized it pretty well. But I feel like when we stumbled across the topic of, the internal politics of how, these politicians and people in power work and the international affairs, I feel like it really gave me a lot of insight, and I feel Aditya really helped out in that. Yeah, that's all.
Great. That's perfect. That was the entire idea behind the discussion, so that we can figure out what different discourses occur in different countries. Right. Group five. Payal, Gopal, and one more person, Kaushika, if I'm not wrong, was there in that room.
It
Or
was Kaushika, Gopal, and I.
hmm.
So essentially, we three discussed, had like a discussion on like India's economic stance, political and like international stance India has. So economic may we discussed upon how like India is a more import centric country rather than an export centric country, and how we are like heavily dependent on countries like China for a major part of our manufacturing, and how we directly shifted from like a primary sector to a tertiary sector instead of having major development in manufacturing. Then we had like a discussion on India's like international stance in the global paradigm. So, for example, how India is like a rising power along with China and Asia. So there is always going to be like a tussle existing between these two, especially since the debate around the China's establishment of like secret ports and how India is tackling that issue, or like the extraction debate, the problem with like the extraction border areas with China. So how that is always going to exist, but at the same time, in on like global platforms like BRICS, China and India have like some kind of agreement on, or like some kind of civil agreement when it comes to platforms like BRICS. Then we discussed like India's position regarding like Israel and Palestine, how India was one of the first few countries who recognized Palestine as a nation, but at the same time, it does like that. Reprimand like Israel for his actions, but can't exactly take a stance against Israel because of their long-lasting partnership. Then how like regarding like the Bangladesh with the previous government, India had like a great relation. So they don't the right wings in India do not are not exactly happy with the change in power because they don't know what kind of power is going to come in Bangladesh. So that is going to change the dynamics with Bangladesh as a whole. Then how India like has a good influence on international platforms and like Security Council and everything. But then again, because of like issues with China, it can never exactly come into like become like a part of like P5 or something. So how that is going to exist? So at the same time, India needs to have like a good relation with their neighbors or establish like a good image on the international platform. But at the same time, as a rising power needs to take like a firm stance or regarding their like military issues and their policies, etc. I think that
Perfect.
sums up the discussion.
So that gave me a very interesting perspective into all your discussions too. Okay, we just have a short amount of material left to go through. I will share the presentations with you as well at the end of the session. Just give me like a second to reshare. Great. Okay, we'll just discuss three major concepts around international relations in the global discourse, right? What is realism? So essentially, realism states three primary goals, right? That states are primarily driven by national interest and security, that international systems are anarchic and lacking a central authority, and that military forces and alliances are key tools for maintaining power and balance. So these are the theoretical frameworks in which realism occurs in global dynamics, right? So this simply means that states are self-interested in seeking power and security, and then there are only systems where if you have a display of power, you might be the one who is going to take victory regardless of whatever other inclinations are there. Some examples of this on history would be aspects like the colonial rules of different nations, but also say the Soviet Union and other state actors which were very prominently seeking power through different means. Nazi regime in Germany also would be one key example. The second one is liberalism. Liberalism is essentially based on, again, three different tenets. It seeks that cooperation and interdependence is there so that conflicts are reduced between different states, and that peace is promoted by the maintenance of international institutions, international law, and that diplomacy, commerce through institutions and through different channels would enhance cooperation between states and make a system where people will not be sort of going into war, and that economic interdependence would be like discouraging this aspect of going into war for people, because then societies are so intermingled that they have no other choice but to be dependent on each other, which is what sort of like Trump is against right now and is creating a lot of different modes around right now. The third one, and the last one that we'll be discussing in terms of the three great concepts, is constructivism. So, constructivism essentially means that there are certain things where in international structures, ideas are going to be shared or value systems are going to be shared by different countries. So, for example, democratic countries would prefer being democratic, and things would like to be the same in terms of shaping their own identities and political interests. And these are influenced by aspects like culture and normative values of different states and social interactions. Yes, debater B, I'm not sure of what your name is, so I'll just have to recount that. Yes, your question, please.
Hello, so yeah, my question to you is that you previously talked about globalization and this entire concept of multiculturalism, that now people must be allowed to adopt into many cultures, and people should be interchanging their culture and stuff. But do you not think that people are very like possessive about their culture, because no, and also like about their identity, because culture eventually is a part of your identity, and you know um and the white privileged people, or like the white supremacists who are racist, they like or like, I'm not trying to like be like very rude here, but like essentially the white women, they tan, but essentially they're also people who hate who hate those black people. So all of these people are only opting into the values or like the tangible aspects of the cultures of those ethnic communities, but that is not of any benefit when the problem of racism is still existing, it is still entrenched. So the concepts like cosmopolitanism or like globalization or these things, they're not of any benefit. So do you really think that cosmopolitanism is like really creating like, or like giving people any benefits out of it, except for the fact that you can perhaps be sitting in Pakistan or India and still be able to read magazines or newspapers like The Economist? Except those, like, what is the major premise of cosmopolitanism that makes it so useful for people in the current status quo?
Right. So we discussed two aspects, right? Globalization and cultural homogenization. So I think when you're discussing aspects around that, I think one of the fundamental things is that we don't discard all other theories, that we do understand that there are different cultural identities in states. This is where you debate upon, right? That where do we actually benefit the stakeholders, and where can we convince these people who are maybe, say, pardon the utilization of this term, but racist or maybe bigoted or having certain internal biases, how do we convince these actors to change, right? Because even in any social issue, we have always classified in debates that there are three different segments of people that we're dealing with. one who are conservatives who believe in that system regardless, one who are fence sitters who are very, very unsure about which side to take, like go left or go right. And then there are people who are sort of like much more against the idea, and it's harder for them to be convinced into joining this idea. So the idea of cultural homogenization is not a very universal concept, and nor is everybody a proponent of that concept. So we are just discussing concepts here. The problem here is that how do we sort of allay these issues of race is what I get from your like question, right? So I think the problem here simply becomes the fact that it's not that cut and dry. So there are very subjective norms around this. So somebody who is very bigoted and very racist, it's very hard for them to be convinced to not be racist, but it's on a probability scale more likely that if they are exposed to more ideas and they're exposed to more knowledge, that they might make the jump towards being, say, maybe less racist or have, say, less amount of problems. There are other checks and balances that are there in the world, right? For example, if we say there are social institutions, that if there are more social institutions discussing the same things, for example, LGBTQ issues or the issues around how cultural differences have created problems in terms of physical interactions with people, or maybe cultural interactions with people, or maybe even conversations around race. So all of these things have more chance for discourse when you have, say, a lot more social institutions going up and talking about this. So we even discussed this idea, right, that media also has a very important influence in global narratives. So the more that people are calling out these individuals, the more that actions are taken against these, because there are laws, legal systems, and other systems which are already in place to curtail a lot of social harms that are there. So on a debate scale, I think the best thing that you can do is sort of like give me a comparative in terms of understanding how those cultural norms are better off in your world by sort of giving more chance for change, but then also where it is worse off in terms of cultural homogenization, because there might be different motions which need different things, right? So for example, on a motion about preservation of cultural heritage, it might be more of your in your interest to preserve cultural identity than go for cultural homogenization. So that decision is something that we will be discussing when we are discussing aspects like how to apply IR and other metrics towards debates themselves. But it simply means that you need to choose a forum which is going to best address your issues, right? So, for example, if you're talking about cultural identity and you think that cultural identity needs to be preserved, then you will go against cultural homogenization. You would give examples like normative value of what your culture is, why your culture should be preserved, what happens when you preserve culture, that it means that the ethnic identity, the history of the people are preserved. What is the benefit of preserving that history and preserving those ideas? So I think that is a chain of things that you sort of get by going through that approach as well, right? So there's no cut and dry answer to anything, but I think the way that you approach these issues are sort of like giving me on a perspective value or on a probability value what is better off in your paradigm, right? I hope that answers your question. So I think the major problem here is to sort of understand what kind of principle you need to apply in that debate, and then also what kind of idea would best work to solve the issue that you're trying to deal with. So if you're dealing with race, it's better to have sort of different cultural influences and call out mechanisms like media, and then legal mechanisms which have strong political influences, but also large call out mechanism by, say, social media people or, say, political spheres and media outlets where they simply call people out for being bigoted or maybe racist to begin with. So all of these things sort of have to be strategically used in your debate. So there are different ideas that you can sort of explore. Because of the paucity of time, we can't go down and discuss every aspect of it, but those are the ideas that you sort of need to sort of utilize in the space. Hope that helps. Right. Any follow-up or should we move on? Debater B? Okay, I'm assuming that clarifies your question. Let's just quickly go through the rest of the material, right? So there are two different concepts in terms of how international relations utilize strategies. One is the utilization through hard power, and one is the utilization through soft power. Hard power essentially means that there's a harder stance taken by the country by using immediate action like military engagement or economic coercion, like suddenly cutting off finances or creating economic escalation by completely cutting off trade, which makes it very, very probable that it is risky for call outs by other countries, but also it might be very costly for countries, maybe because they might lose human capital, they might lose social capital, they might lose economic capital, right? The other end of the spectrum is essentially relying on soft power, which would mean you are taking diplomatic stances and building long term relationships and stability. The example being that India's relationship with the United States has improved over a long period of time because they have had diplomatic engagement and diplomatic discussions going on between different spaces. So these are the two contrasting positions which we sort of apply in terms of how we are analyzing different aspects of action needed to be taken by a state, right? Okay. So globalization and international relations. This comes back to the point that debater B was also raising. So the globalization is essentially the idea that the world is getting interconnected and that the world's economies and societies are impacted through exchange of culture and exchange through idea. So there are two major things that we'll be discussing. This is not covering the entirety of globalization, but it essentially means in terms of economics that there is free trade and investment across border, and that countries are sort of economically interdependent on each other. On a cultural context, it simply means that cultural values and norms are shuffled around the world, and that you have exchange of cultural values and cultural norms, and that there are influences in international relations through, say, previous conflict which has given you common ground historically, or maybe say other ideas in terms of cultural knowledge exchanges or programs that you have with different countries. So what globalization essentially means is that there is an impact in terms of how different countries are right now operating. So which simply means that in the current cultural narrative or in the current economic narrative, states have to consider a lot of different factors in terms of how they're influenced in their decision making, which is how it ties back into your debate space. So let's just quickly then look at how we are applying IR to debates, which is the key thing that you need to sort of deal with. After we've discussed all the theoretical material, there are three major frameworks that you can utilize to see how international relations are utilized in a debate forum. These three I's are essentially interests, institutions, and ideologies or ideas. So this simply means the factor that, okay, there are states which have certain common interests. For example, two states might want certain amount of resources which are available in each other's states, right? So they might be better off exchanging those things. So there is more easier predictions in terms of how state would act on those levels, and therefore you can sort of ideate around how state interests would be better motivated when you're analyzing stakeholder benefits for that debate. The second is institutions. These simply mean that how do, say, UN give rise to dialogues around human rights issues or humanitarian issues, or how theories would differently operate on different levels, right? So liberalism is something which caters to, say, institutions like the United Nations or the World Bank and IMF, as we were discussing. So institutions have different political inclinations, and how different people will work in these aspects would be very much motivated through how these institutions have been framed in the world, or maybe historically developed in that world as well. Ideologies are simply how states are motivated. Like China, with a communist political framework, has a very different mechanism to support different institutions and different political spheres of influence than, say, states like United States and India and Pakistan, which are more inclined towards democratic institutions because they're democratic states to begin with. So these three things have to be sort of like your major points of analyzing how stakeholders would be operating and how actors would be operating in the world, and then utilize all the theoretical material that we've discussed to apply to different debate frameworks. I'll give you a couple of examples as well. Yes, debater, go on.
Okay, yes. So as you just mentioned that every nation, every country has their own, form of ideology that what they essentially stand up for. And same is the case with nationalism. Nationalism is a very subjective term. Every country has their own definition of nationalism. Like America, they think that their type of nationalism is the American dream. And but oftentimes nationalism is confused with patriotism. But then essentially it is also used as a mask by fascist leaders like perhaps Hitler, who motivate people on on this national superiority, that oh, you are the most superior nations and now somehow you have the right to exploit all these other people. So do you really think that nationalism is always bad? Can nationalism ever be good? Or like, is nationalism extreme in its every form?
I'll give you a very simple example here, right? It might be in my nation's interest to have economic warfare, but it might also be in my nation's interest to have economic trade. So, what I simply mean here is that the perspective of nationalism becomes very subjective in global discourse as well, and how countries themselves are operating in it. The current governance in, say, United States have a very different political ideology system in terms of how economics should be shaped and how trade should happen between countries than, say, the previous administration. So it's very subjective to also understand how people are going to view nationalism from term to term. So the commonalities of nationalism would sort of remain the same, right? That there would be certain national interests that would be preserved over, say, other things which other nations are more inclined towards. Here, the idea of sovereignty and the idea of nation-based states having own political interests to be preserved is very important to consider, right? Why is that so? The idea simply comes around the fact that, okay, I might have a different political inclination in my state to observe different things. You might have a different political inclinations to the point that my inclinations are aligning with yours to give me some mutual benefit between states. It's easier for me to give certain amount of, say, leeway to operate in terms of those dynamics. So this is where sort of like how national interests and nationalism could sort of be discussed in terms of the way in which is approached, right? So I think yes, yeah, pretty sure. It's late for a couple of people. I will share material and other things as well. So what institutions would simply mean here is also very different, because in Trump's administration, having, say, utilization from the United States Supreme Court is very different from how the Supreme Court would have operated in the Biden administration. So nationalistic discourses are very subjective. It's very hard, but political considerations which are currently applicable to states are more realistic for you to approach and sort of like understand, and that becomes a much more fairer thing to assess in a debate as well. So when you're looking at different aspects on how to like allay different ideas of nationalism in debate context, I think one, you need to again look at what are the interests of the actors themselves. What are these institutions in these actors world going to do? What are these ideological differences that these actors countries have with the other actors countries, or in terms of, say, other discourses that are happening in a global perspective? In the case of these three, wherever you can sort of justify that they're going to be better off, it is where you sort of like win the debate on that particular aspect and metric, right? So whenever you are sort of like having some amount of confusion, be it from globalization or homogenization of cultural context or how nationalism is operating, I understand that it's very subjective to sort of like assess all of these things, but it's also very easy to give normative value as to how it is probably going to give you a better country or not going to give you a better country, and where you can sort of have the most amount of change occurring, right? So that subjectivity can sort of also mean that you have some amount of interplay in your arguments as well, which helps you sort of build arguments which might not be immediately approachable to different individuals, but also is very easily accessible in terms of the impacts that it has to the stakeholders of that debate, right? Any follow up, or is that clear now? Okay, moving on to the next part then. Okay, how do you leverage IR theory for like policy consequences of debate? One, we have these discussions which we had, right? That power shifts might happen. There might be certain tensions which occur because of economic escalations or military buildup. So tensions might be there that if, for example, Canada is being now given a tariff by the United States, there's a lot of tension that is occurring between Canada and the US. Ukraine and is Russia conflict has always created very much amount of tensions in terms of these regions. So there are different plays in which you can sort of analyze that maybe that if a country does something which would look like infringing on sovereignty of country B, then there might be a military buildup. So it is more likely that this would be consequentially harmful to you in that world, right? So those kind of things can sort of be analyzed in terms of how you are predicting consequences of policy making, and that can be used in your debate frameworks as well. Secondly, when you're talking about predictions in terms of how institutions are effective, you can see how multilateral trade agreements might be effective in certain places. You can also see how the UN might be or might not be effective in, say, maybe providing humanitarian aid, sorry, and maybe sort of um, conflict-oriented issues being sorted out by the UN. So the UNSC might have more effectiveness to it. So that is where you sort of like also prioritize which kind of institutional measures that you're trying to discuss within your debate space as well. For example, let's take the ICJ. The ICJ can issue warrants, but it's not very easy for them to actually conduct those arrests and then put people before their trials, right? So that is also something that becomes an important piece of the consideration when you're looking at, say, how institutional effectiveness works and how different aspects work. Constructivist presentations or predictions are also around that. You can say that how you have certain ideological motivations, how LGBTQ movements probably, or how other feminist movements or other movements might have international persuasiveness by taking certain actions through different institutions, or might have certain amount of benefits by taking certain stances in the global world, right? So all of these things can sort of be utilized to predict the consequences of policy and utilized by you in terms of framing better arguments for that motion. So just a simple example here. Whenever you're doing this, try to think about what might be the probable cause of action, and then that helps clarify a lot of vague claims. I've seen in a lot of debates that IR becomes very confusing to sort of judge because, and also to speak about, because it becomes very hard to assess where is the most amount of value going to be given, or where are the exact harms which can sort of be mitigated by either side. What you can do here is simply then, on a scale of likelihood, tell judges on a clarification, or tell in your arguments how you are going to quantify outcomes and why is your outcomes more sort of relevant or more sort of feasible to occur in that world. And that is how you can sort of like build sort of debating arguments for international relations related emotions. Now let's just give you a bit of background about where to find materials from. These are essentially where you need to sort of look at next after this workshop. You sort of would be better off reading past events like how Cold War used nuclear deterrence and how nuclear debates are currently situated around, say, post Cold War eras. You can sort of analyze empirical data. You can give examples like GDPs and other things as well when you're debating. And you can also provide case studies, which can be simple ideas around how historically maybe certain countries have done certain things which have led to certain outcome. So if that country does the same thing again, there might be the similar outcomes which are coming in for that country later on. So what you simply do here is to preempt even counter arguments. You have to sort of ideate around what kind of aspect you're using for your debate, and then sort of highlighting what kind of metrics that aspect is using and showing why there are certain amount of benefits to utilizing that model, and then giving the counter argument or preempting the counter argument from the other side as well. Right. In critical analysis of global issues, what essentially you need to right now do when this workshop ends, I will send you this link to the presentation. There is an entire amount of material beyond what I have discussed in this workshop as well on them, and I'll share some links to resources as well. So when you're critically analyzing different global issues, there are certain things that you need to be very careful about. One, that you do not operate on biases. Two, that you understand that issues are interlinked. For example, climate change might be interlinked to human rights might be interlinked to issues like labor and regulations in terms of debates and economic forecasting. So there are different aspects in which you can view different perspectives of global issues. So you have to be very careful in addressing all of these very particularly to the problems that are assessed within it. Now, practical skills. Where can you go back and then read about IR? There are certain things like government documents, examples being UN resolutions and also reports from different external affairs ministries and government bodies. There are also NGO reports, treaties, and media archives that you can sort of refer. For example, UNCLOS is a very important thing for maritime discourse. There are other things like International Human Rights Document, UNDP documents, UNCRC documents, Child Rights Convention documents, which you can sort of refer to give yourself ideas as to how different aspects of international law occur and how you can sort of like build your ideas better in terms of that debate. Secondary sources where you can read about blog articles and then different discourses around international relations and historical case studies, and also journal articles if you're up for it. These are very time consuming. So there are also certain things that I will give you in terms of reference. There might be matter files which discuss IR motions and give you stock arguments. You can refer to them as well, which will give you some ideas as to how to run better IR debates. Also, very sure that you need this, that you have an evaluation about what kind of things you're discussing. Authenticity, credibility, relevance, bias, all of these things become very important in terms of considering how your debate is being viewed by the average reasonable voter, but also by the other side, so that there are not easy call outs to what you're discussing in the debate space as well. Lastly, just use as many conflicting, not conflicting per se, but cohabitating ideas in terms of your arguments. So do not just try to argue on the idea that government ideology dictates this, so this might occur. Try to bring in practical implications to these ideas as well to help you be better in terms of analyzing what to say when you are debating on IR. We'll just skip a couple of these things. Now, how to sort of like predict the opponent's ideas in IR motions. There might be challenges that you can run to their evidence. There might be qualitative welfare metrics that you can challenge as well. For example, you can say there's a better idea to support another institution where there are more tangible outcomes coming to the stakeholder. So that can be something that you can use to provide counter arguments. You can try to see what your opponent is trying to achieve through their argumentation. For example, they might be prioritizing security or they might be prioritizing cooperation. You can then build your rebuttals around that by saying that what would work better in your world in terms of that particular security metric, or is security really the primary concern for that actor? So there are things that you can better understand if you understand clearly what your opponent is trying to bring around for the debate space as well. Thirdly, you have to prepare ideas around what if something has occurred, how can something else relate to it? So if you say that NATO expansion could deter Russia, you can sort of counter it by saying that Ukraine was still invaded in 2014. So those what if questions would also help you sort of give ideas around how you can sort of structure and discuss loopholes. Right. All of these other things are things that you sort of have an idea about. Just on a concluding remark, be very careful when you are discussing things around IR in terms of how you are impacting stakeholders, because you might think that the motivation for that stakeholder will be something which is very, very important, but rather there might be some other motivations or inclination that these particular actors might have, which would be more important in the discussion to be had. So try to weigh your arguments through a lens of practicality, but also through the lens of how much impactful they are to the stakeholders that you're discussing. Otherwise, thank you for the participation in the session. I will be taking questions now as well, if you have any. Yes, debater B.
Yes, so my question is that, as you just mentioned about ICJ and United Nations, that they can essentially make sanctions, but they cannot essentially, impose them. They do not have such strong mechanisms to essentially act upon them. So, like, what is the, existence of these institutions at the first place? Do we have like really big tangible benefits out of them, or like if we just talk about that, if a country is not, is not, agreeing to do ceasefire in another country, so like uh, and the United Nations has failed, so like why is it still existing? I mean, like, because after the world wars, the basic purpose of making these organizations was to protect human rights. So if it has failed in its very agenda, so like, do you not think they should cease to exist?
Okay, I think there are two things. One, there's a practical implication and there's a principled implication here. The practical implication is there's no real other forum where every country in the world will sort of come up and discuss issues. So even if the agenda is simply passed by a majority vote, by calling out a country, that still gives you like a stance to justify that there's something wrong happening in a country and that there's some amount of call out mechanisms that are there, which would then simply lead to other forms of measures. So, for example, in the UN, if there's a discussion and there are 5 Security Council members who are supporting the discussion, it is much more likely that certain amount of contingencies are made, right? So this can look like international institutions trying to roadblock certain problematic things. For example, the European Union did take sanctions against Russia. Now, the effectiveness of those sanctions can be discussed. Sure, there are a lot of sanctions which are very useless to be applied. But in the broader framework of things, there's a utilitarian perspective of the UN, and then there's an actual sort of value proposition that what is UN as an institution supposed to principally look like and ideologically do. So if that ideological robustness of that institution is still correct in the sense that, right, I'm getting so many people here, I'm still discussing these topics, the relevance of the institution still remains to a certain degree. Now, of course, in different places, there would be different arguments which would run the idea that UN has failed as an institution. But there are examples where you can see that UN has succeeded. For example, the UN Relief Fund does put a lot of relief into the ground for drought prone areas or natural disaster areas. The UN development program UNDP is doing a lot more in terms of developing different assets for developing nations or underdeveloped nations. There are ways in which relief forces do occur, and then there are also ways in which peacekeeping forces are sent out. Though the ambit of these peacekeeping forces succeeding is again up to debate, right? So, on a total ideological perspective, I think the framework of the UN is still beneficial. Personally, I think there are ways in which I do question the UN as well, right? For simply saying that UN is toothless in a lot of fields. It's very bad at sanctioning countries when there's war. There's very bad in terms of aligning against the interest of what the UN Security Council has. Because the UNSC has a lot of veto power in terms of how security measures are taken or sanction measures are taken in these countries, right, which are in global conflict. So I think those kind of challenges do exist, but there are certain benefits to the UN as well. So you have to sort of like balance it out in a debate by saying that are those benefits worth it in contrast to those harms, or are those harms so important in terms of consideration that there are no benefits accruing to that state. For example, for India, the UN is a very nice body. For Ukraine, the UN is a nice place to keep calling Russia out. For Russia, it doesn't like being called out in the UN, and it is being hammered by a lot of different states. So different states do have different political motivations, and they do also have different like ideas that they want to sort of subscribe to. So the idea is not simply is it Halima, could you please mute yourself? Right, thank you. So the idea is not simply the fact that is it completely a failure of an institution. The idea is that at that point of time, when you're discussing certain aspects, can you prove to me that is UN the right institution to operate, or is UN the wrong institution to operate in those aspects? Right? Is that clear? Are there any other questions? I'll be glad to take
Yes,
a
I
couple
have
more.
another question.
Sure.
I hope I'm audible.
Yeah, yeah.
Yes, so my the other question is that how to debate on an IR motion that is in retrospective, like if there is a motion like this House regrets the fall of Soviet Union. So what should be the framework here?
So see
How
here again. Yeah, go
sorry,
on.
or how should I just developing my arguments? Because
Hmm.
this does need a lot of historical context, right? And also like in the present, because I am regretting this motion, right? So how do I do that? Also, I have oh, should I ask this question right now or just save it like for like when you okay, yeah, sorry. Um so if there is a motion like this house would want Russia and Ukraine to like go to a peace agreement, uh, considering its territorial sovereignty and democracy, and it should prioritize this agreement of peace over ceasefire. So how to argue this one?
I mean, I think there are certain things that you need to look at first for regrets motion, right? Even if you have very little spec knowledge about how the world is or how history operates in that area, I think the simple thing that you can have an idea about is how the world looks like today. So if you're saying that Ukraine and Russia are such a big conflict, and there are certain states post Soviet Union which are very like downtrodden, or Russia has had so much issue. So you can use those to build your ideas about how the world would have looked like if the Soviet Union continued, which would be that there is a very stable power, third act power, which is against, say, China or the US as well, because Soviet Union was at the end of the day a very huge economic and political power, which have a lot of different like power discourses between different nations. So in THR motions, you do need to have some amount of idea about history. I think that is where I gave you the first idea that you do need to go and give some thought about reading certain things around history, which include what were the essential power constraints like power dynamics, what were the major wars that happened, what were the inclinations behind those wars, what happened when the Cold War happened, what happened when Soviet Union sort of like dismissed. The recorded meeting will be shared in the group, so don't worry about that. So essentially, there are different like aspects around how to sort of proliferate different benefits to these countries. Would Ukraine benefit from the presence of a unified Soviet Union? Maybe yes, maybe not. Would places like Bosnia and Herzegovina be better off? Maybe, maybe not. So there are different ways. Belarus might have different inclinations here as well. So with current like geopolitical frameworks, you can sort of have discussions as to why Russia might, the absence of Russia and the presence of the Soviet Union might be better, because Russia is also very problematic as a state as well, right? So those are the ways in which you can sort of like have discussions around different dynamics. On your second question about say impacting between peace and say ceasefire in say a state in like a conflict between Russia and Ukraine, you simply have to look at what are the political motivations of the states currently. Russia wants to annex Crimea, Russia wants to annex a couple of regions from Ukraine, and Russia wants to claim that the entirety of Ukraine be sort of taken back into them and re-establish this idea of a Soviet Union, pseudo-Soviet Union state. What Ukraine simply wants is the sovereign integrity that it used to have before it was invaded and to protect its territorial interests. Now, when you have these two sort of ideas that you have clarified between what the two states want, then you can sort of like look at what kind of benefits would they have when they're doing a peace offering, or what kind of benefits do they have when they're having a ceasefire. Ceasefires have very different motivations because ceasefires are often tremendously unstable and broken down, but peace agreements are much more likely to be held better because the terms might be better off. But here also, Ukraine might be worse off because maybe they would have to secede some land. Russia might be worse off because they can't get into a unification of regions which they believe to be culturally part of their own country. So those are the ways in which you can sort of have to analyze what are the political motivations, cultural motivations of the states, what kind of impacts can you bring to the state itself, and why are those more beneficial to the state, and why are they more subjectively better off than the other side. So this would vary being governed up. So I think you have to sort of look at what is presented in what sense. So I think the motion would need to be reframed a bit to make it a bit more balanced too, right? So it would simply be around the idea that this house believes that it is in the interest of Ukraine to go for a peace agreement over ceasefire against Russia. So that might be the kind of motion that you're looking at. And which simply means that you need to look at the political motivations of Ukraine, what are the interests of Ukraine as an actor, and then sort of build your stance through that. Any other questions? Feel free to ask if there's anything related to IR, international economics, or anything else. Otherwise, we'll just wrap up. It's been a very long session. I'm pretty sure it's pretty late in a lot of countries around. Great. Considering there are no other questions, you can reach out to me. I'm there on the group. Thank you so much for joining in the session. I'll just stop the recording. Okay, Ojasvi, you have a question.